I even had it in red in my notes, and I still didn't do it. Okay, thank you, John.
Appreciate you, John. Okay, so this is just to tell you a little bit about myself, right? Is that the
Right.
question?
Mhm.
Okay, sorry guys, got a little diverted there with the record button. My name is Valerie Morris. I live in a tiny town right next to one of you listening here in Franktown, Colorado, and but I'm originally from the Chicago area, and I stumbled my way into marketing thanks to the right place, right time, the recession in 08, 09. There just were a number of factors that kind of pushed me into the marketing space. And as I started positioning myself more and more with content and whatnot to do more speaking, I actually found myself seeing that I needed to really have a book. If I wanted to get out and speak, do trainings, all that kind of stuff, I needed to have a book. And so I started down this path of researching, do I go the self-publishing route versus trying to get a book deal? I did all the research that I'm sure everyone on this call has probably done to some level of just making some basic decisions. And as I got closer and closer to getting the final book in into reality, I realized that there's a lot of marketing that's missing in the publishing world today. And there's a lot of spammy marketing happening as well. A lot of people think you can just hit the easy button and get a million reviews for your book and it's, all the things. And any of us that have put a book out into the world or in the process of it now, you know that there's a lot of effort, a lot of work that actually goes on behind the scenes. And so I've been living in this digital marketing space, in the content marketing space for the work that I do with clients. And then I started doing it for myself and realizing for my book, all that needed to go into putting myself out there. And after putting my book out and having a successful launch, I had people coming to me kind of on the side. Here and there, they would trickle in and say, "Hey, could you do that for my book? Could you help me launch my book?" And then I had people coming to me and asking me, "Hey, could you help my client do this?" I'd have people asking me, "Hey, can I pick your brain about how to do this? Could you coach me through it?" And so over the last 6 or so years, I've really walked through. I mean, I'm losing count at this point of how many people I've acted as a launch manager, or I've put together a marketing plan around their book. And one of the big things that I'm realizing with people is that it's hard to put ourselves out there, right? It's hard to put your face out there. A lot of us would rather stay either behind the computer or we don't want to appear too egotistical, but you have to put yourself out there. You're the face of your book. And podcasting has become a really effective tool for me to promote my book, but also to promote myself as an author, as the persona of Valerie Morris and the person that people are going to trust in terms of my book's subject matter. And so over the years, I've done a lot of work with podcasts for authors and non-authors. So I kind of have seen the podcasting space from a lot of different angles. And I also have a few podcasts of my own that I've put out. And what's nice about that is, having it your space to kind of choose what you want the style to look like. Do you have guests or not? There's all sorts of different things you can do with it. But more recently, I've been seeing more and more of, you know, I'm getting more and more referrals from being a guest on other people's podcasts. And that's a little bit more of what we're going to be talking about tonight. But, ping me anytime if you want to talk podcasting in other arenas as well. But I think tonight we're focusing on the guesting side and the importance and how we do more of that in a good way.
So what kind of success have you seen with authors when they've gotten onto the right podcast?
Well, I think the thing that you need to realize about having your putting yourself out there on somebody else's podcast is that they have already have their own set of audience that's been built up however long they've been around. And so you are almost borrowing their audience. So that's another, like, it's a nice way to think about it, especially if this is your first book or your only book. And a lot of authors have not necessarily, you've been so focused on the book itself that to think about building up an email list or your social media following is sometimes a secondary thought process. And a lot of times people are thinking about that even after the book's already out. And you could be building that following at any point, right? But the nice thing about going on somebody else's podcast is you are being featured as an expert to their network. And so it's a new group of kind of fresh blood that you can get in front of that really opens the door for other conversations. The other thing about it is there's just kind of this like subtle psychology in being a guest on someone else's show. And so, oh, Mike thought highly enough of me that he's featuring me to his podcast network, right? And so just the mere fact that you're a guest on someone else's show signals to your network, as well as anyone who comes across that show and that episode, that you're an expert, whether they listen to much of your episode or not. And so that's where, like, when you go on as a guest, you want to make sure that you're talking about it. You want to make sure that you're sharing about that because that sends these subconscious signals to your network, whether they have time to listen to that episode or not, that you're out and about and doing amazing things. So those are just kind of the first two things that come to mind. Just, this could be relevant for wherever you are in the process, even if you're still working on your manuscript, you can still be positioning yourself as an expert around your subject matter, around your genre, around your process of writing. Like you can be featuring yourself in a lot of different ways.
Well, can I chip in on this too? The fastest way to sell books is to sell them to speak to groups. And you can go in person and travel across the country and speak to a group, or you can do it from the comfort of your own home. Don't even have to leave. You can wear shorts and a nice shirt, and you look like you're all dressed up for the occasion. So I just think it's a great direction to go. Um,
Yeah.
so so
I was actually on an interview 2 nights ago. I don't think I'll do this very much because I'm not much of a night owl, but the interview started at 9 o'clock at night because it was with somebody who was over in Europe. And so he was up super early for his time zone. It was late for me. And we were having this meeting, and I'm now leveraging more of a global audience in this manner by being on his podcast. So, if you really are committed to it, you could be doing interviews any time of the day.
so there's two routes to go. You can either start your own podcast or try to get on other people's podcasts. Tell us the strengths and the weaknesses of both, and which is most important.
Okay, I don't know if there's necessarily one that's more important than another. Um, I've had a handful of podcasts for different reasons, and we could have a whole night just talking about why you have those. I will say I used my first podcast was specifically for writing my book. I invited about 15 people to be interviewed on topics that I was already planning on talking about in my book. I took snippets from those interviews, wove them into my manuscript, referencing and citing expert or whoever it was. And then I released those episodes after my book launched, one every week. And so I had a reason to talk about my book for 15 weeks without talking about just go buy my book. It was, hey, today's expert or this week's expert is Pat Flynn, and he came in and was part of chapter blah blah blah, and you can get the full book and all the things. And it was really fun because then to a bigger name like having Pat Flynn come on to do this, it was like, hey Pat, not only are you going to be featured in my book, it not only am I going to promote your episode, you're going to be part of this VIP promotion around my book launch. And all of this for, X number of minutes of your time. It was a very easy sell for people to say yes to doing that. So I did that around my podcast. That was a short-lived podcast, and I was fine with those 15 episodes. That's all I wanted, right?
So real quick, so what
Yeah.
do people need to get in order to host their own podcast?
Okay, very basics. You need to pay for podcast hosting. Most computers have basic software for recording audio, and if you wanted to get fancier, recording video. Now, you can get fancier with microphones and ring lights and speakers and sound mixers and all those things. But basic, you just need a microphone and a way to record. You do need to be able to have some basics for like cropping the audio and the production side of it. But if you've got a Mac, you've probably got all that software built into your computer. Podcast hosting, it's pretty, there's a lot of different options out there. I'm personally a fan of Captivate, but that's just my own personal experience. But it's pretty simple. You can get obviously more sophisticated if you want, but I see a lot of people get hung up on, I don't have a fancy enough microphone, or I need a fancier sound mixer and whatnot. And they let perfection get in the way of actually getting it done. Um, but yeah, so back to your earlier question though about like, is it better? It's all dependent upon your goals, you know? For me, those 15 episodes, the goal of that was to give me material to promote my book, right? But around the same time, if I didn't already have an audience built up over the 10 years or so that I'd already been in business, and this book was maybe a new genre or whatnot, I would be wanting to get on other podcasts to start building up my notoriety in that subject matter. And so, I come across a lot of authors who, maybe they've just been in their profession for 20, 30 years, and they haven't really thought like a marketer would to say, oh, I should have been collecting email addresses and building up an email list. Or maybe I don't have a Facebook page and following for this yet, or I don't have Instagram, or my LinkedIn profile is just for my job. I haven't thought about building up my network for this book about whatever the case may be. And so if you feel like your network feels a little small, going on other people's shows can be a really effective way to put yourself out there. And then obviously, like I said before, it makes you look really good to the people who are already following you.
Now, how do you market a podcast?
Like like being on as a guest.
Well, if you're a podcast host, you're going to be a guest on somebody else's podcast. I mean, what are some ways you can market that?
Well, I
Like,
mean,
like like your
so
podcast when you did your
yeah.
different chapters, how did you market that?
Yeah, so I honestly like I dripped it out over the 15 weeks. A lot of that work was done ahead of time. I'm a big fan of batching work. So I got to my launch day and all of those episodes were just queued, ready to go out.
Queued
Um,
where?
in the podcast, like hosting software,
Okay.
you can schedule all the episodes to go out at certain times on certain days. So you can do a lot of that work ahead of time so that, as anybody who's launched a book knows, launch day, if you're doing big pushes for sales on or around launch day, you're exhausted by the end of it, you know? So the last thing you want to do is think about like making a social media post about what blah blah blah. But as far as like, when you get on a show and it goes live, there's a lot of things. I mean, that episode is gold. And a lot of people will talk about it just once. They won't ever talk about it again. And the reality is, most of those shows are probably evergreen in nature, meaning that you could talk about this subject in April 2025 just as easily as you could in December 2027. The subject is going to be just as relevant. Um, obviously, sometimes there's time sensitive subjects that come up, but by and large, when it comes to books, since your book is usually fairly evergreen in content, um, a lot of the stuff you're going to be talking about as a guest is going to be probably pretty similar. So what I like to think about, and this is where like my content marketing background comes into play, is I try to look through and see if there's any, good quotable quotes. Are there any good, stories that I mention? Any tips that I shared? Any frequently asked questions that come up that kind of tie into the topics that I talked about? I always like to thank, like just doing an announcement post saying like, hey, huge thanks to Mike for having me on as a guest on, Illumify podcasts, like, and show some love to them. And then afterwards, you could tie in any sort of quote from that episode and just make sure that you're pointing back to the episode itself. Now, along those lines, a lot of people are go on all these shows and authors, here's where this is a big opportunity for us because a lot of us we have our own websites or we have a page or section of another website, maybe it's associated with our business, that's about our book or about our writing, you know? And these are great spots to kind of create a brag board, if you will, and a running list of all of the shows you've been on. And so, especially if you're trying to be a public speaker, this is a great opportunity because it's public speaking. Like we're talking into a microphone here. Obviously we're not on a stage, but if someone's thinking of hiring you to be on a stage, they can get a really good sense of you by listening to you speak, even if it's on a podcast or a YouTube video. So, at least on my website, I've got a running list. I usually set them up as like a blog post with a certain tag. So that way I can have a page that has just those blog posts from that tag. And, it's going to auto populate things like the date or whatnot. But you can set up your own feature about how Valerie Morris was featured on Illumify Media's podcast. Here's a short summary of their discussion. Here's a link to where you can watch it on YouTube and a link to where you can watch it or listen to it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and all the stuff. So you create a spot on your website where this information lives. So then when you make any sort of post to promote you being on the show, instead of it going directly to that episode, they're going to your website first, where you're being showcased in these mentions. And it's just nice social proof. And then you have this running list that when you go to think about making social media content for your brand, you have this repository of all of these mentions and all of these links that you could be promoting and re-promoting. And that's the same thing even with your own show. I mean, have it where it's all pointing back to your website, not directly to Apple Podcasts or to Spotify links. Point them back to your site first, and promote episodes more than once. This is one things I see most podcasters, they just talk about the show at the release of the show, and very rarely do they come back and cycle through. And you do all this work to make an episode and you just don't promote it. So,
Now,
um,
here's a question, kind of a different direction change. That's genius. These are amazing ideas. And actually, we're going to talk a little bit later about how you can, if you want to invite Valerie to be part of your book promotion team, we'll talk about that. But one question I have, like, what's the best amount of time on a podcast, like duration? Is it 30 minutes? Is it 20 minutes? What's the
yeah.
optimal time?
Okay, it's been a while since I looked up the exact stats, and I know that it lives out there somewhere. So someone feel free to correct me. But last I heard, it was between 20 and 25 minutes, which I mean, we've been talking now for more than that on this webinar, and it's it's nice. I was actually talking to someone today about this because with podcasts, especially if it's your own, a lot of times people will binge listen to maybe two or three episodes. And a lot of the podcast player apps will just automatically roll you into the next episode when the first one's done. So I'm a fan of that 20 to 25-minute span because you could, instead of it being one 60-minute session, you might have two smaller episodes that you get more downloads to your show. It gives you a little bit more notoriety. People can digest it. And also a lot of times people will listen to podcasts on like 1.5 or even 2 times speed. And so that 20-25 minutes is really closer to like 15 to 18 minutes, right? Like they're going through things a lot faster. So yeah, 20 to 25 minutes and that goes fast.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Another question. What are some things you do to make sure you're maximizing these opportunities when you're a guest?
Yeah, okay. So I always like to listen to at least a few episodes of the show that I'm going to be a guest on, just so I go in prepared. Um, and then I also like to make sure that I've got kind of my core questions like practiced and I've got them down. I don't want to necessarily come across as overly, stiff in my responses to things, but I also want to make sure that I'm prepared. And a lot of shows will provide you with some rough framework. So, like on whenever I have a guest on my podcast, I usually like to give them a rough framework of, hey, here are 5 or 6 questions that we'll kind of aim to work through. And if the conversation's flowing, we might deviate a little bit if the banter and the conversation is going well. But roughly, here's where we'll kind of start. And sometimes you have people on, and it's very clear that they are not the best at conversations and all that kind of stuff. So sometimes I do stick to those main questions. Um, but I personally enjoy conversations where you can tell they kind of meandered a little bit because the conversation was flowing. But if there are questions that they're providing, I do like to be prepared with those, just so that I am not stumbling over my words, having a lot of ums and ahs and other filler words. So that's just kind of one of the things I like to do. I also like to make sure that I'm showing up as well as I can. So that means being in a space that I know won't have a lot of distractions in terms of noises or things happening in the background. I'm not in a co-working space where there's people walking behind me. I'm not in a room that has, you know, sound echoing off every single wall. There's something in the room that's absorbing sound a little bit. Um, I try to kind of have a conscious mind about when I'm scheduling the interview with them to make sure, like, okay, I'm not going to be sitting in my car with sketchy Wi-Fi connection. I want to make sure that I'm showing up as well as I can to that show host. I also like to think through, and this is just a public speaking thing in general, is just to think about how fast are you talking? And especially when you think about how people will listen to podcasts on 1.5 or 2 times speed. If you've ever tried listening to some podcasts in at that speed, I mean, I do it all the time. And some shows I can handle it, and then some shows I'm like, I can't keep up. I can't, they're talking fast at normal speed. So if you speed that up to get through a podcast faster, it's nearly impossible to understand. So just trying to give yourself those reminders of talking slowly and reminding yourself to look at the camera instead of looking at maybe your screen if you're on a computer. Just wherever your camera is, making sure that you're giving good eye contact, knowing that it's potentially going to be on camera. Those are just some general to-dos. I also like to have water handy because you never know when you're going to need it, if you're going to have a cough attack or something like that. So I always like to have water handy, even if I don't need it. And then, we talked a little bit, like you know, you can be very basic just to get up and going, but it is nice if you do invest in a decent quality microphone. There's a lot of great ones that you can get for less than $150. You don't have to necessarily break the bank. You can get some for even cheaper than that. But a nice microphone or just a decent microphone, as opposed to just the microphone on your laptop, is going to give your host the best quality audio to work with. And they're going to really appreciate that, as opposed to if you have really distracting audio, then it's going to be a scenario where, I mean, they may not even be able to use your show. It may never make it to publication if the audio is too bad. So, and then one of the other things is just, smiling and being yourself. A lot of people, they forget to smile. They're so focused, they're so serious, and we all know what it sounds like when people are smiling when they're talking. You can hear the difference. And so, just remember to smile and be yourself. And even I found myself, one of my dreams someday is to co-host a podcast with someone. Got to find the right topic, the right fit, the right person. But my favorite shows to listen to are co-hosted shows. And I love it because you can kind of hear the back and forth, the inflection of the conversation versus somebody that's just like preaching at you. And you can hear them smile, or you can hear them with like their sassiness. And even if I'm not watching it on YouTube or on camera, I'm just listening, I can visualize what their expression is based on the tone of their voice. And I just really appreciate that.
Can I jump in and say another thing about being interviewed? Um, Podcast hosts are looking for succinct answers. So if
Hmm.
you give a 10-minute answer to a question, they may shut down the interview because they want, they have their own strategy of where they want to go with this podcast. And if
Yep.
you drone on and on and on, then it's not going to go the direction they want it to go. So think short,
Yeah.
to the point, and to your point, have some rehearsed answers, things that you say, things that are catchy that you can
Yep.
repeat. That always makes for a good podcast. I was at Denver International Airport. I had this horrible flight and delay with baggage, and I walked by one of the local television crews, and they asked if they could interview me, and I said sure. So and I thought about the topic. It was about Denver International Airport. They interviewed me, and I gave these short answers. It was about 3-minute interview, and the woman goes, "Wow, I actually interviewed somebody that knew what they were talking about." And it's just helpful to be ready and prepared and give those short answers.
Yeah. Well, and one other thing I like to do right before we hit record, because usually you get on with somebody and there's a little bit of chit chat before you actually start the interview. And so during that little chit chat for those 5 or 10 minutes, one of the things I always like to ask people is, what's your ideal length that you want to go? Because that can help me gauge, like, oh gosh, like they really want to go the full hour. I need to make sure that I'm giving enough meat to fill up the 60 minutes. If they're like, this episode is 15 minutes long, then I know I have to be very, very brief with how I'm presenting the material. So I always like to ask that right before, just to make sure that I am following what they're looking for.
To what extent during your interviews do you do your self-promotion stuff? If it's either a website or a book, like 90/10, or give us an idea, rule of thumb.
Yeah, I struggle with like putting myself out there too much with that kind of stuff, but I think there's simple things you could weave in the conversation of just like, oh, I mean, gosh, like we actually had a client that were producing their podcast and their guest introduction was almost 15 minutes long. The guy just droned on and on and on. And we had to somehow figure out how to condense that introduction to be less than a minute so we could get on with the rest of the episode. Okay, that spoke to your point a few seconds ago. But in that sentence, I wove in that we do podcast production, right? And so I'm a bigger fan of like just weaving some things in, like, oh, when I was working on my book about blah, 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 this was one of the struggles that I came across. And I did all this research around XYZ, and I've been weaving that in with the consulting work that I've been doing with clients, and we've been seeing amazing results. There's always little kind of tie-ins you can make, but most shows will offer to say, like, hey, at the end, where can people find out more from you? You know, I've heard of some shows that weave that in closer to the front of the conversation or middle. Um, but just be prepared for, do you have any sort of special offer that you want to promote for the show? A lot of times people get into situations like this and they're so excited about the interview that they forget that the host is probably going to ask them, do you have a freebie or some sort of lead magnet, or where can people get more from you? You need to make sure you're prepared for that. And I've noticed a lot of people struggle with that. They're like, oh, yeah, you can find me at Instagram and here and Facebook and blah, blah, blah. And, I'm a bigger fan of like, keep it short and simple because anybody that's listening is probably only going to grasp one little bit. Give them your website URL and the place I hang out most on social media is LinkedIn. Come find me there. And most people can look up your name and find your face and match it. So I personally try to keep that part pretty simple. But I'm also trying to think through, do I have a lead magnet that so and so can put in their show notes to offer to people? And a lot of show guests, or sorry, a lot of hosts will happily put in links for you into the show notes. They're very happy to do that, but they're not going to go search them out. You have to be ready to give it to them.
All right. So we have about 10 minutes before we're going to open it up to questions. So, Valerie, if you could take us through the process of how do you find podcasts to be on? How do you contact them? What do you say to try to get them to hook them in?
Yeah. Okay, so one thing I will say when it comes to getting on shows, this kind of feels like PR of like trying to get on TV shows or trying to get on the news and some of those things. There's all sorts of tips and tricks, and a lot of PR agencies have relationships with these media outlets, right? So take a cue from how traditional PR works and focus on the relationship. Getting a cold pitch from somebody is they have no idea who you are. You've got to give them a reason for it to be interesting. And that's where you really need to take a look at what their show is about. Make sure that they, first of all, accept guests. There's a lot of shows out there that are co-hosted. They don't do interviews very much, or it's a solo show and they don't do interviews very much. And if you were to go pitch them on that, they would be like, I mean, you got to be pretty amazing for me to even consider this since I don't know you. Um, so make sure you know who you're pitching, not just like, oh, these are the top 10, poetry podcasts out there. I'm going to go try to get on all of them. You want to make sure that those shows are actually looking for people. I also like to connect with the show in terms of like if they have any sort of social media presence, see if I can connect with the host on LinkedIn, and try to build up a little bit of rapport that way. And so if you are emailing some sort of cold pitch, you have kind of that secondary of like 1-2 punch, right? You might email them, but you might also shoot them a LinkedIn message and say like, hey, I just sent you an inquiry about accepting guests on your show. Would love to chat about that. There's also a lot of places. I mean, I know we've got some people throwing some stuff in the chats of different websites where people are actively looking for guests. But even when you have those scenarios, you have to make sure that you are putting yourself in the best foot forward. So you have to walk the walk, talk the talk of, being a guest worthy of coming on. And that's things like creating a media kit, making sure that your brand presence as a whole looks good, that your website looks solid, that you know what your talking points are. Um, those types of websites are not necessarily a slam dunk just because so and so is actively looking for guests for their show. You have to make sure that your presence and what you would be bringing to that episode is going to be of value. And that's where you have to start thinking about what is your persona and your brand as an author. And getting back to what I said at the beginning, it's hard for us to put ourselves out there sometimes. And this is one of those instances where you really need to think about what are you bringing to the table? Why would somebody invite you to come speak at a local bookstore? Why would someone have you come speak to a group of high school or college students? Why would someone have you come speak on their podcast? You need to really kind of talk yourself up. And if you're struggling with that, find a few good friends and ask them what you're bringing to the table. Ask them to help brag about you to yourself and help you get that perspective on things.
It's
And
it's
hire.
it's what's the problem that you're solving?
Hmm.
Because everybody's got a problem. It makes it a little more challenging if you're fiction. If you're nonfiction, it's a lot easier. Um, so two questions. First of all,
Yeah.
what goes into a media kit? Number two, how do you get fiction authors onto podcasts?
Okay. So Media Kit, I mean, headshot, all your core profiles of like where people can find you, what you talk about, maybe a sampling of, what you bring to the table, some talking points, some quotable quotes from you. And if you've been on other shows, get some testimonials from those speakers, those hosts. There's a little bit more that goes into that, but that's kind of the core. It's kind of like your resume as a speaker, if you will. For fiction, it's interesting. There's a lot of like different and topics and talking points and kind of themes that you're just like working through your character's development. So you can speak to some of those kinds of things, but I think with fiction, I actually had well, he wrote a memoir self-help type of book first, and now he's almost done with his first novel. And so I had him on as a guest, and we were talking about the writing process. And he actually had a lot of amazing insights to talk about the difference between nonfiction and fiction and what that process has looked like. There's a lot that you can share about that side of it that really people that just sit in the nonfiction space, they have a hard time going over and thinking about plot and character development and getting in your character's head. There's so many different aspects to that that you can speak to, and you can drop little hints as to what your book's about without giving away the whole story. But yet you get people excited about who you are as an author, that you're creating these ideas. I think that's a very compelling angle you can go at as a fiction writer, and just about your journey, like if your book's already out, how has this journey of publishing and getting to this point been? Anybody with a book can speak to that process once it's done. So there's a lot that you can speak to. And I would just encourage you, if you're just starting off, one of the best things you can do is go listen to a ton of podcasts. Go listen to podcasts of other fiction authors and hear what they're talking about. Go listen to other interviews of people who have podcasts, or I'm sorry, they have books that are supporting maybe a coaching business or a consulting business. And their book is a tool for that business, not just a book in and of itself. Like, go listen and seek out what are people saying and get a feel for what you could possibly say in your own situation.
Well, and Tiffany Stockton commented in the chat box, and I said this over and over again to people. If you're going to have themes in your novel, and you're going to have aha moments when you're researching your novel that you can speak on forgiveness or redemption or whatever those themes are, and you become an authority on that topic. And while you're explaining, and so then you can give all sorts of bullet points or questions for interviewers, and then you can just drop in here or there. Well, I mentioned this in chapter 8 when I do this in my story, and so because
Yeah.
this also works when you're speaking for groups. I've done workshops on how to create speaking gigs. Same thing. You can do it with fiction the same way.
It's all exposure, right? Like, I mean, you don't have to give away everything, but
Right.
it's an opportunity for you to put yourself out there. I think about, you look at most libraries. If you live in a tiny town, you might not get as much of this, but our local library that me and my kids go to, I mean, they have authors coming in at least once a month, pretty big names from time to time. And those are special events. Sometimes they're free, but usually you have to buy a ticket and you're going and listening to an author talk. I mean, we've probably all sat in on something like that to some extent. And are they talking about the plot of their books? Very rarely. Instead, they're talking about, how they came up with the idea for this character to do this, or how did they, tell us about how you got into writing in the first place, and where's the craziest place you've sat to work? What's your writing practice look like? There's a lot of that kind of stuff that people are very interested about. They want to see the behind the scenes, the process that goes into creating a book because there's a lot of people out there who are really scared to ever think about writing a book. Or it sounds like a cool idea, but definitely not for them. And so the fact that you've done it is so incredibly amazing for them.
Right. And we're going to open it up in just a second. Actually, if you want to start typing in questions, go right ahead. But there are Joseph Leonard had sent me some services. There's subscription services which I've checked out: Matchmaker FM, Radio Guest List, Podcast Guest List, and I discovered when I checked them out, they're really not that expensive. I mean, it's like $20 a month. Do
Mhm.
you have a preference for like one of those subscription services that
Yeah,
you find podcasts?
I think one of the hard things about all of these is that they can be overwhelming, you know? I've tried a lot of them and there's some that have, I feel like, more success than others, but you have to have consistency with folks, you know? One email is rarely going to get you onto a show. And at the same time, you don't want to be obnoxious to people. You want to put your best foot forward. You want to have that consistency and strategy around what shows are you trying to get on. You don't want to just get on any old show. And as you get more and more picky, as you start getting on more and more shows, you might decide, hey, so and so who's brand new and only has 2 episodes out, it's not worth my time because they don't really have an audience yet. But those first few times you get going, if you've never done any guest interview, you might just want the reps. You might
Right.
just want the practice to get going and get the exposure and the fact that you have something to share about. But as you get more and more developed in it, you might be more picky about, hey, I'm only going to go on shows that are talking about this specific problem. I'm not going to go on shows that are book review shows or something like that, where it could be any type of reader listening. I want to get on shows where, historical romance is the main theme. If that's your genre, you might get more picky about how you are positioning yourself. And that's where a lot of the strategy comes into play. And a lot of times people will do a burst of activity and then nothing.
Right.
And they
Well,
forget about positioning themselves and they forget that if you want to be showing up at least once a month on new people's shows, you have to be doing the legwork on a regular basis behind the scenes to make sure that you're getting pitched and then scheduled and those shows are getting produced so that you do have a show coming out every month to position yourself well. And if you're doing it as like a lot of authors do this now where it's like a book tour, a podcast book tour, and they're specifically trying to get on shows on or around their launch to talk about their book. Well, that legwork has to happen months in advance because those shows take time to produce. It takes time to schedule them. It takes time to get the yes to come on the show. So, yes, there's lots of platforms that you can find shows where people are looking for guests, but you still have to do a fair amount of work to make sure you're getting pitched the right way to those shows.
right. Well, and when you go onto these shows, you can't pitch it as I'm here to promote my book. You got to have a compelling angle that they're going to want to have on their show because they're not out there just to promote your book. So I'm gonna open it up to some questions. John Lewis asks, how do you see the reality of AI helping authors receive strategic direction and podcast leads? And what role do you imagine a live coach organization like Illumify play in the future?
Well, I mean, I could see AI helping to filter shows a little bit better. So the legwork to search and find the right potential show is great. One of the nice things, now granted, I this is a software I pay for, but there's a few others that do similar stuff. But I recently dug into a tool called Cast Magic, and I can throw in clips into Cast Magic. So let's say I'm a guest on somebody's show, I can throw that audio clip or the link for that show into Cast Magic, and I can ask it to create a social media post for me. Now, I will say, as a content creator, you have to either have trained your model really, 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 really well, which most people don't do, or you need to be willing to just do a quick edit after the AI does some of the basics. So I see, you know, marketing agencies and publishers just being able to either speed up and offer more to clients or help focus the attention more on the things that are more strategy related and letting AI maybe streamline some of the initial work. But again, at this point, I don't think AI is at a point where you can fully trust it. You do need to have that human eye editing what the search results are
Right.
and what those different pieces are. I mean, there's a lot of clues when something is written by AI. So if you are pitching based off something that you just had ChatGPT create for you and you haven't customized it or personalized it in any way, you're not probably going to see a lot of results. In today's world, as AI becomes more and more of a thing, this real world interaction where we're potentially coughing or sneezing or stumbling over our words, I much prefer seeing that than something where I'm wondering, is that video made by AI? That that person doesn't have any wrinkles. They don't have any zits. Like, is that person real? You know, I think our world, and I don't, maybe I'm just, I don't think I'm the minority here. I think most of us are probably craving this, that the more and more there's AI content out in the world, the more we want real interaction from people. And authors are very well positioned to provide real interaction with people. And I think the more you lean into that, the better. And so there's things like video pitch, like send an amateur video of you walking on your smartphone and send that to a podcast host to pitch yourself. You can include some written copy, but something to show that, hey, Mike, I really wanted to touch base with you. I loved your episode about blah blah blah, and I think I could be really great to come on your show and talk about XYZ. I mean, if I got a pitch from somebody like that, I'd pay attention, right? Um, but to somebody's comment here, garbage in, garbage out. If I'm getting garbage in my inbox, it's getting deleted right away. So,
Right. Another question from Susan Miner. I was on a podcast arranged for by my publisher. I am now an indie author with the same book. Is that podcast considered the publisher's work product? So you're talking about rights here.
yeah,
Boy, you know what? You need to talk to the podcaster, I think.
right. Well, yeah, I guess the question is it the publisher's podcast? Or in this case, if it's another, they just arranged the arrangement, the publisher wouldn't own anything. It would be the question for the host of that show, whether whoever that is, that you would ask. And most podcast hosts have no problem with you promoting that episode, especially if you were a featured guest on it, because ultimately it's pointing people back to their show. So I would be shocked if anyone has any problems with that, but you might just ask the question, and you might ask the question of, hey, do you have any issues with me splicing out any clips from
Right.
this episode to use in any other way? So I would say just ask the question. I mean, again, if you're giving credit at the bottom of a social media post and you pulled a small clip out from it, I mean, again, you're not claiming you made it, like, but you were part of it. Most people won't have an issue with that. But if you're concerned about it, it's worth going back and asking.
Right. So we've talked about all these different things. It's probably overwhelming. Even though, and it's a little overwhelming for me. Like, what kind of services do you provide through Illumify where you can do some of the podcasting legwork?
Yeah, so yeah, we've done a lot with guests around helping them create that media kit, give them advice on, here's how to go do it yourself. So we offer coaching here, but also we'll do the legwork for you, which this is one of the things that, when we're doing book launch management for people, that it's so helpful because I'm the one telling your launch team what to do. You, as the author, are part of the conversation, but you're not the one saying, go buy my book, go buy my book. I'm saying, go buy Mike's book. You know, In this instance, you look a little bit more professional and polished because you have a spokesperson saying, Mike, you should have John on your podcast. Like, and here's why. Um, and when you have that third party perspective, it's like, oh, John has people, he's not just this, grassroots author trying to make it, out in the world on your own. Now, depending upon the podcast, sometimes that's a good and a bad thing. But again, I think the more personalized you can make it, the better. But somebody to do the legwork and the consistency around that legwork is really helpful. You can focus on seeing what are they recommending and making those decisions instead of spending hours scouring to find the exact right show for the right fit and doing all the administrative back and forth before you get the show. So you
Right.
could focus just on being scheduled and talking.
Right. That's great. So real quick, we do have one person on our webinar today, Joseph Leonard, who has a podcast. Take a screenshot if you want to be on his podcast. He's an Illumify author, and he's done a lot of podcasts himself. So anyway, take a screenshot of that, or you can watch the replay. I am going to post this on our YouTube channel, the video. So last of all, if you want to schedule a strategy session with Valerie, maybe you've already published a book. I have a bit.ly. Again, screenshots are miracles. Take a screenshot of this, and you can schedule a time. She does online scheduling like I do. So you can talk to her. If you need more than just podcasting, you're interested in publishing a book, there's publishingpossibilities.com. And I'll leave this on, but Valerie, you're such a natural at book marketing, and you always come up with stuff when we talk that I would have never thought of. And so just want to thank you for joining us today. And we'll probably do some things in the future around marketing because Valerie just knows what she's doing. So any final words, parting words, Valerie?
Yeah, I would just say, if you haven't embraced listening to podcasts yourself, uh, go do it because there's so much I've learned from listening to podcasts. And if you're like Tanya Ann, who's waving from down the road, apparently one of my neighbors, um, you know, where I live, I spend a lot of time in my car driving. I live a little bit out in the country, but out walking the dog, weeding the garden, all the things. Take advantage of those little moments when you have some of this kind of white space and downtime to listen to things. There are podcasts about literally everything out there, and you could hear from a bunch of different experts and get some ideas percolating. I gotta be honest, I get some of my best ideas listening I have like two shows that I listen to on a regular basis, and it's a lot of co-hosted banter and a few golden nugget ideas, and it gets me my wheels spinning while I'm listening for ideas for myself. So my notes function on my phone. There's a lot of ideas written down because I'll be out walking with my dogs. So embrace podcasts yourself as a consumer, and that'll also give you an idea of kind of what you appreciate and love listening to yourself to contribute to other episodes where you might be more of the featured guest.
Wow. Really good stuff. Got a lot of great information in an hour. Thank you again, everyone. We'll probably do some other kind of webinar in a month or two, and just appreciate you joining us. And thank you again, Valerie, for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And thank you guys all for the great comments and questions. And if you're local or even if you're not, feel free to connect with me over on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear about what you're up to, especially when it comes to your book.
All right, everyone. Well, have a great night. We'll see you soon. Bye.